Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are talking about yet another intermediary institution. Over the past couple of modules, we've been discussing a number of different intermediary institutions that help to link the sort of hallowed ground of our formal political institutions, that is, Congress, the Supreme Court, the presidency, all of these sort of federal institutions to citizens, to the actual voters and citizens who are making decisions and trying to express their preferences to government. And so we've thought about a number of these different intermediaries, including but not limited to the media and political parties. Today, though, I want to talk about a crucial intermediary that really takes us back to some of the core discussions that we had at the very beginning of this course. And that is, I want to reintroduce the concept of pluralism in talking about interest groups. And so if we recall some of these original discussions that we were having when we were thinking about constitutional sort of design ideas, we can think about these framers of the Constitution as really worried about and hoping for a government that would avoid the process of sort of conflicting factions gumming up the works with these rival ideas and with these sort of interpersonal rivalries as well that, as we saw, emerged really quickly in the United States context. So, it didn't take decades. It only took a few years, essentially, for people like Hamilton and Aaron Burr to be feuding, and eventually, conflicts coming to violence in American politics, and of course, the rise of factions. But if you recall, if we go back to documents like Federalist 51 and Federalist 10, James Madison essentially made the case that if we had enough group interests in America, if we were sort of a diverse enough country from the perspective of political sort of wants and political willpower, then perhaps all of these different groups would sort of balance each other out. And that's really a concept that has sort of remained to this day as an important one for the study of politics, this idea of pluralism, which is a theory that essentially states, going all the way back to Madison's arguments, that free interests are going to form in a free and open civil society a bunch of competing groups that are going to eventually check and balance each other out, essentially, in terms of the contestation that they have politically. So if we think about, again, politics, or in a democratic society, the government being an arena for the contestation of who gets what, right? This kind of safe place where we can, instead of resorting to violence, have our conflicts and have all of our debates and discussions, and eventually arise at compromises that mean that everyone's going to be eventually happy to some extent with the outcome. Pluralism essentially says that in, a robust civil society kind of polity, we're going to end up having these competing groups that arise naturally to contest in this arena. So it's essentially, if you build it, they will come, right? If you provide a free and fair place, essentially, where groups can have their debates and try to hash out who gets what, then groups are going to form and groups are going to come to that arena to contest the ideas. And so groups are then organizing, essentially, very much naturally around their stated central goals. So if you need something, if you have some kind of grievance, right, if something is going wrong in your life where you're observing that government could help fix this problem, then naturally you're going to seek out like-minded people, and those like-minded people and you are going to form some kind of group that's going to be able to put pressure on government. And so the idea is that the goals of individuals are being aggregated or being grouped together into these groups that are then going to influence government. And I think really the crux of this, again, the idea of if you build it, if you provide this arena for contestation, they will come. If you have an interest, then you should be able to form, if it doesn't exist, or if it already exists, join some kind of group that's going to represent you. So this is what we might call a heavenly chorus of organized interests, all kinds of different groups coming together to duke it out and to figure out who gets what. So in terms of the modern sort of vision of this kind of contestation, again, we can think about this as being something separate from political parties. This is not the party system. Something separate from media, something separate from all these other intermediary institutions. In modern American politics, this has taken the form essentially of interest groups. Interest groups have arisen in order to represent the interests of specific Americans who have common goals and shared ideas about the way that the country should work and the kinds of resources that they would like to obtain. And we've seen that, right? Essentially, there are thousands and thousands of interest groups that engage in all kinds of activities in Washington every single day. And so perhaps this is a vindication of the theory of pluralism. Right? Maybe this is essentially saying, look, this is the heavenly chorus of organized interest and action. Each individual American, if they have some sort of grievance and they have some sort of desire that they want to express to government, they can be free to form or to join some kind of interest group that's going to put pressure on government. And eventually, those interest groups are going to have some kind of positive effect in terms of giving those people what they want. So I think that's an open question, an empirical question. And as political scientists, we like questions like that because we can use our research to be able to understand whether or not those sort of theoretical assumptions that are being made by pluralism are actually holding up in real life, if they actually bear out. And so maybe, one tentative hypothesis could be that this explosion of interest groups over the last several decades proves pluralism right. And this is essentially allowing for free expression and a distribution of power in our society, which essentially balances all the interests of a wide variety of Americans. Or there is a counter-argument, which is to say that perhaps this system is not serving everyone. And I think to answer that question of whether or not we think that the pluralist ideal is being obtained, given the modern interest group society, we need to ask the corollary question, how exactly is it that interest groups do their jobs in America today? So before we really assess these claims, we want to think about what interest groups are. And certainly there are kind of two ideal types of interest groups in America that we could think about. The first one being what we might call staff organizations. And so these are organizations that essentially exist in Washington and hire paid professionals to do all of the stuff that we'll talk about in a moment that interest groups do on a daily basis to put that pressure on government to contest in the arena of ideas in Washington. So those staff organizations essentially exist without a substantial need for rank and file members of a group, that is regular ordinary citizens who care about what the organization is trying to advocate for. It doesn't require them to actually have much of an active role in the organization itself. So if we think of an organization like, for example, the AARP, one of America's largest and most powerful interest groups, the American Association for Retired Persons, you don't need to, join up with some sort of massive protest demonstration organized by the AARP for the AARP to be powerful. In fact, what you can do instead is pay your dues and get a little magazine every month and read it and know that your AARP member dues are going to hire these staffers who are going to be doing all kinds of different activities in Washington to make sure that retired people get their voice in Washington. We could contrast this example with membership groups. And these are groups where the participation of rank and file members are key, right? Where they're actually being called upon to do a lot of stuff to actually put pressure because they don't have that mechanism for acquiring a lot of resources that can then be funneled towards a staff organization. So historically, unions are a really good example of membership groups where being a member entails you actually doing some stuff, right? Getting organized at the ground level. Maybe this involves things like picketing, like striking, doing things that actually, require your involvement and participation to have your voice be heard. And so obviously, again, these are ideal types, right? There's a lot of organizations where there is some degree of member action and calls to action that are nevertheless staff organizations. And today there are staff organizations which, nevertheless are relying to some extent on the participation of membership groups. And so these, again, some of these groups are going to blend some of these strategies. But we could also think about the fact that there's a lot of staff organizations out there today and a lot of organizations that are essentially big office buildings without the real sort of involvement of membership groups on a daily basis. Nevertheless, I think both sort of flavors of group are important to think about when talking about interest groups. And particularly, this is important because groups are involved in so many different kinds of attempts at influencing the sort of political discourse in America, and again, who gets what. And so again, we can think about these various groups, these membership organizations, or these kind of more staff-oriented, sort of office-based kinds of groups, doing a variety of different things. And so the first and most basic one, the thing that you probably were thinking about as I started mentioning interest groups in the first place, is this idea of direct lobbying. And so that is a process by which these groups hire lobbyists who are paid professionals who work in and around Washington, essentially, who are directly involved in trying to sort of get the ear of government officials to try to state their case and make sure that their particular talking points are at the top of mind, essentially, of legislators when they're going to do their jobs. So direct lobbying obviously is a very, very important component of this, and one that many, many millions of dollars are spent every year hiring these lobbyists who have access and who have influence to try to, again, compete in this marketplace of ideas by changing the thought process of legislators. I'll say more on lobbying in a moment. This is, I think, a topic that a lot of Americans view with a lot of disdain. We think of lobbying as being corrupt, essentially. And I want to make the case in just a moment that lobbying is a little more complex than maybe what most Americans think it is. But we certainly want to go talk about these other things before we get to that discussion. The second one, and certainly I'm sure that from watching the Super Bowl to watching stuff on TV, anytime you will see advertisements from interest groups that are actually seeking to influence public opinion. And so this is one component of the jobs of interest groups that is can't be understated. This idea that you might actually see, and in fact, going back to the AARP, I know for a fact that during football games and other major televised events, the AARP actually runs direct ads to the public to try to influence those audiences into thinking that the AARP is an organization that's doing things to help seniors. And so this appeal to citizens can have sort of a double effect. One, it might cause those citizens themselves to put pressure on elected officials to do things that the organization, the interest group, wants, but also it might have an effect in terms of it being an appeal to membership. So a lot of the time, if you see an AARP ad or some other ad for an interest group, you're going to see an appeal that says, join us, right? If you're somebody who fits this description, if you're a retired person, or if you're somebody who's going to be retired very soon, join this organization, and together, essentially with your dues, we're going to end up having a bigger influence, and you'll get what you want more. Another, third example of this is essentially lobbying the staffers who support members of Congress and other elected officials. Is actually an important component of lobbying, an important component of what these groups are doing on a day-to-day basis. It's actually not just about going to a member of Congress and saying, "Hey, can I have a minute? I want to talk to you about the environment. I want to talk to you about elder care. I want to talk to you about student loans or whatever." Right? It's not just about that. It's also about saying, "Hey, we as an interest group, we have a lot of resources, and some of those resources can be informational. And so we can actually help you, stressed out staffers who are trying to advise your representative or whatever on this bill that's coming before Congress. We want to know whether to vote for or against it. We can give you all these fact sheets that will help you figure out what to do, how to help them." And so, of course, congressional staff, these salaries are pitiful compared to the going rates in Washington, and there essentially are fewer and fewer staffers over time available to do a lot of this hard work. And so actually staffers have come to really rely on lobbyists to provide, essentially to do a lot of this background work so that they can do their jobs more efficiently. And so if staffers can understand what kinds of positions these lobbyists are going to advocate for from the get-go, if they know essentially that these are biased sources, that they might be able to triangulate a little bit and say, okay, well, here's what this group thinks, here's what that group thinks, here's what we should think on the basis of these groups' evaluations, given that we know what these groups essentially, what their agendas are and what their angles are. Another thing is, when we think about activating constituents, this is, again, something that goes back more to this idea of direct kind of involvement of members, right? Membership organizations. So you could also, send an email or some kind of flyer or mailer to people who are members of the interest group and say, "Hey, members, there's a new bill that's being discussed in committee right now. It's a really big problem for us, and we really want you to write your members of Congress and tell them to get rid of it. Tell them to vote against it in committee, or tell them to vote against it on the floor. This is, I think, another important way that interest groups can do this job, is to actually get constituents upset, and again, essentially circumvent the lobbying process, get citizens to go directly to their representatives and get mad. And then finally, the last policy that we could think about is, of course, amici, right? The amicus curiae briefs that we've talked about in the context of the Supreme Court, because the court is also, I think, a very active and important player in determining who gets what in the United States. That's not a controversial opinion, right? Obviously, in their discussions of what laws are constitutional, and their discussions of how to interpret the law, right? The court plays an incredibly important role, especially in an era of gridlocked government. And so, again, these amicus curiae briefs, if interest groups are able to make the case that they're an interested party in these proceedings, they'll be able to provide briefs that come in to the Supreme Court outside of the two actual groups that are contesting the case, and this provides, again, an information subsidy, or another source of information for the Supreme Court justices and their clerks to be able to make informed decisions when they vote on the case. So all of these different sort of activities and more, I think, are very important steps that interest groups take on a daily basis to try to influence the direction of legislation, of the interpretation of laws, of court cases, of executive orders, all kinds of things, the outcomes of the policy process in American politics that go a long way in determining, at the end of the day, who gets what, when, where, and how. Now, again, I wanted to go back to this discussion of lobbying. We had talked earlier about lobbying. It turns out that despite the fact that a lot of Americans think of lobbying as being this extremely corrupt kind of, smoke-filled room, handshake deal kind of thing, where lobbyists will come to members of Congress and buy them these extravagant dinners or whatever, and wine and dine them, and bend their ear and try to convince them to vote against essentially what their constituents want. Lobbyists are really important to legislators, but it's not because of the steak, and it's not because of the wining and dining. It's essentially because these lobbyists, again, are providing informational subsidies and support. And critically, the idea here is not that they're trying to convince somebody to vote against their constituency or trying to vote one way or the other. It's actually really that they're trying to preach to the choir. They're trying to support their allies. So lobbyists are very keenly aware of, particularly in a polarized Congress where Republicans are often quite conservative and Democrats are often quite liberal, they know essentially who their allies are in Congress, and members of Congress also know which groups are aligned with them on the issues as well. So again, instead of trying to take a very liberal member of Congress and get them to adopt a very conservative stance on an issue, right, the voting on these bills is going to end up being very polarized no matter what. We see that essentially lobbyists are trying as much as possible to rally around their allied members and provide them with information to be more effective in Congress, more efficient. And also, right, it's not just about trying to convince them to switch their stance, but it's also trying to stay top of mind. It's trying to make sure that that particular set of issues, and again, we know which way those members of Congress are likely to vote. It's about trying to make sure that those issues are, again, more salient, more readily available. Going back to Robert Dahl and his criteria for effective democratic contestation, we can think about control over the political agenda. And this is where lobbyists might have an even more important effect than in terms of persuading people to vote one way or the other, right? It's more about saying, hey, I represent the AARP. Let me remind you that Social Security is a very important concept, a very important topic when you're legislating. And don't forget about your commitment to seniors, right? Hey, I represent the ACLU, and I want to remind you, right, that our civil liberties are very important principles of government, and we want you to not forget when you're crafting legislation, or particularly when you're choosing which bills to sponsor or co-sponsor, which bills to put in the hopper, that you think about bills that are going to reflect those kinds of ideas, right? Or hey, I represent college students and their crushing student loan debt. I encourage you to think about college students when you're thinking about what the first thing is that you wake up thinking about on any given day when you're trying to legislate. So again, it's not just about persuading anybody of any issue position. It's about keeping your particular group top of mind with legislators. And that crucially, is where I think who gets what is influenced by lobbyists. And so, again, just to recap what I've just said, right? Lobbying is an information subsidy. It's trying to get your allies to be more efficient, more effective by giving them all the information they need about the specific topics of the day. And your goal is not to change minds. It's really to keep your favorite issue or your favorite sort of group as a lobbyist on the minds of the representatives. It's the top of the head response model, but in this case, it's being applied to elites. So you are trying to prime elites to think about your group as much as you can. But of course, before we, do anything in Congress, before we have any kind of influence, before we write amicus curiae briefs and hire lawyers to be able to do all this work, you're going to need resources in order to do this. Interest groups need resources. And so, of course, we know, think about the AARP magazine and the donations that the AARP receives from its members. Think about unions and the fact that union members pay dues. Think about Greenpeace and other sort of environmental groups that rely on certain strategies where you adopt a whale or something, right? Think about groups like the National Public Radio, right, where you might become a subscriber and you get some sort of trinket, some sort of mug or some sort of pen or a tote bag or something. There's all kinds of different strategies that interest groups can use to be able to effectively recruit resources, be it the time of committed members or money, and most often money, right? You're going to need that to be able to do any of the things that we've talked about so far, right? Any of these things, right? Direct lobbying, going public, lobbying staffers, activating constituents, amicus curiae briefs, any of this stuff. And really the thing that we need to think about next, and the thing that we're going to talk about in class, is how we might be able to recruit those resources to our cause. Because again, going all the way back to the original sort of premise of this discussion today, for pluralism and the theory of pluralism to hold, the idea is that if you have some sort of expressed interest, if you have some kind of grievance, then you should be free and able to effectively form some kind of political group that's going to put pressure on government. And if you, as a group of concerned citizens, fail in that task of actually raising money or raising the resources required to have your voice be heard, then maybe, and just maybe, pluralism is not working the way that it might have been assumed by some of these early democratic theorists and by James Madison. So again, stay tuned. In class, we're going to sort of poke at that premise a little bit more and ask the question of whether or not pluralism really works on the basis of some of the potential challenges or ease of access different groups might have in attempting to gain resources and use those resources, have those at their disposal to do any of these different tasks that we've discussed that interest groups work on. So until then, have a wonderful few days, and I will see you very soon.